Like these are MRCUG 1 Jan 2021 exam recalls. So I'd like to tell you one thing. Recalls are just recalls, right? You don't have to rely on them heavily. Only if you have not read any of these topics, then you should know that these topics are very important and you need to cover them. Besides that, no, I don't think that it is significant. But sometimes you can get questions like which you know nothing about. In that case, use your background knowledge, okay? If you can't apply that, then use process of elimination. What is process of elimination? You will see that you will say that okay, this thing seems logical and this one seems totally illogical, okay? So in that case, you will leave that. So through the process of elimination, you're going to get the answers. Then another important point would be that since there is no negative marking, so don't miss any question please, because this is one mistake. The students, they keep doing such things, and you know that each mark counts, right? And then click on just one answer. If you will click like two answers, then automatically you are going to get 0 credit for it, okay? That is the one point. So let's start. I have students have shared these recalls because since I didn't take exam, so I have no idea. So let's do these questions and I will try to explain everything. And if you think that answer was not adequate or you have a conflicting answer, I'm always open to suggestion. Don't hesitate, just let me know about it. And any question comes to your mind, then please stop me and ask about it. Okay, so question number 1 is that patient has history of preeclampsia. What percentage will have another episode with next pregnancy? So actually, this preeclampsia, the incidence depends upon the gestational age at which the patient developed this PET. If she had PET and she required delivery PET and delivered before 28 weeks, at less than 28 weeks, so in next pregnancy her chance is 1 in 2. So 1 in 2, what percentage is that? That is 50%. Okay, remember these points because they will ask you the same question in the part 2 also. Okay, so next time this poor lady had the same problem, but now she was lucky enough because it developed at after 28 weeks, like she was more than 28 but less than 34 weeks. Okay, this question you are always going to get. So the chance is going to be 1 in 4 or it is equal to 25%. That is one thing. Okay, another question they can ask you, she has had this problem, so what is the chance that she is going to develop chronic hypertension? Okay, your answer is 11%. 11%. Okay, 11% chance that she's going to develop chronic hypertension in the next life. Like it is not now, it will be outside pregnancy. Okay, and other question they like to ask you, that woman has PET, so what are other risks? Any idea? Okay, 17 times higher of risk of having a stroke. Okay, 4 times and 4 times higher risk of, what else can be there? Myocardial infarction. Okay, these are the points. So she has 4 times higher chance of developing myocardial infarction. All of this information has been taken from the TOG article, and for your exam the college says that you need to cover Green Top guidelines and some of the TOG articles also. So everything you need to cover here is available on your web page. Okay, if you, in case you don't find it in the original page, the page number 1, I will repost the link in the group. Okay, if you have any problem, then tell me. But these numbers and incidences, everything is given in your on your page. Okay, please don't miss that. These are very easy marks. Why? Because you don't have to think, you just have to recall. So these are the things. Okay, so if I ask you that what is the incidence of preeclampsia, what will be your answer? Any one of you? 2 to 8%. I hope I have not muted you guys. Recurrence, like I have told you. Okay, then another question, how many of them are going to develop eclampsia? So what is the difference between preeclampsia and eclampsia? So eclampsia, when the patient has PET and she is having convulsions also. Okay, she has convulsions. Okay, so if somebody has this problem, how do we treat them? Like all of you are like practicing doctors, so how would you like to treat a case of PET? Okay, depends upon the gestational age and the BP, like that. What is the BP? Because every time you are discussing management of someone with any medical disorder, don't forget to monitor the baby. Okay, what will happen to the mom and baby versus fetus? Fetus has no rights because he is not born, so not alive, just depends. So your primary patient is the mom, like that. Okay, how you will manage the mom? If he has preeclampsia, give them Mexel. So how much Mexel we are going to give? We are going to give them like 4 grams IV stat, 4 gram IV, and you are going to give that over 10 minutes. Okay, period of 10 minutes. Okay, then maintenance dose, how much? 1 to 2 grams. 1 gram is just not sufficient. Usually we are giving 1 to 2 grams per hour. Okay, for how long? For 24 hours. Then you know about the signs and symptoms of the magnesium toxicity. Okay, so the therapeutic index is that we need to keep it between 4 to 7 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, that is the therapeutic index. If it will go outside this one, patient is going to have toxicity. So what will happen if she has toxicity? Loss of deep tendon reflexes. Okay, tendon reflexes. Okay, then after that she can have like respiratory rate can be low. Okay, what will be the respiratory rate? It can be like 8 to 12 per minute. Okay, that is one thing. Renal output, it will decreases. Okay, so all of these are signs of potassium toxicity. So if there is toxicity, you need to fix it, isn't it so? So give them 10% calcium gluconate over, you are going to give them IV diluted. And why you will not give calcium chloride diluted over 10 minutes? If patient develops any of these complications, give them calcium gluconate 10%, and then you're going to give it over 10 minutes. We have more experience and this is safe drug, that's why we give it. Okay, so then another important question, that in which area of the brain you are going to get this hemorrhage. So what is the most dreadful sequence of this one, this PET? So there can be cerebrovascular accidents. Okay, where? In the white matter. Okay, white matter of the brain, at the junction of the white and the gray matter. That is one thing. Okay, so what complications can occur in the baby? You guys are seeing them all the time, right? So IUGR, that is one thing. So PET, this is an important cause of preterm labor and delivery. So the problem is not only PET, the consequences. Okay, so then the mother is also going to develop, one is cerebrovascular accident, then the second dreadful complication is HELLP syndrome. Okay, so the incidence is low, but you should know that what are the parameters and how to differentiate it with fatty liver of pregnancy. In fatty liver, you are going to get hypoglycemia, and in the rest of the things are going to be the same. But in case of this one, PET, HELLP syndrome, you're not going to get hypoglycemia. Then another thing, differentiating point will be when your patient is having intravascular hemolysis, the red cells are breaking down, and we are going to get lots and lots of LDH into the panel. That is one thing. Okay, let's go to the next one. That is percentage of diabetes mellitus type 2 after gestational diabetes mellitus. So if I ask you what is the most common type of diabetes, DM, that is GDM. Okay, GDM in how much? 87.5%. 87.5%. All of these numbers from NICE guideline. Okay, and type and DM type 2, that is like 7 to 8%. Okay, and IDDM, that is hardly, we are so much worried about it, so it is hardly like 4 to 5%. That is one thing. Okay, so then the second question is, so GDM is the most common. So what causes GDM? Very high level of the human placental lactogen. That's why it is confined to the pregnancy. So here they have asked you that what is the chance that she will develop DM after having this gestational diabetes mellitus. So the answer is 50%. So remember other things, for women who are diagnosed with GDM and whose blood glucose levels they return to normal after birth, then you need to tell them that their chance of having diabetes is very low. So they should get this lifestyle advice like weight control, diet, and exercise. And we should offer them a plasma. This is not blood, plasma glucose test 6 to 13 weeks after the birth to exclude diabetes. And for practical reasons, this might take place at the 6 weeks postnatal check. And if they give you a patient who is returning like after 13 weeks, then what you are going to do, then you will need to test the hemoglobin A1C level, or glycated hemoglobin should be less than 48. So look at this one. If she is coming to you within 6 to 13 weeks, you are going to do the fasting plasma glucose. While if she comes to you after 13 weeks, life may get into her way. So then you are going to test the hemoglobin A1C level. And do not routinely offer a 75 gram 2-hour OGTT. You will offer a referral into the NHS database prevention program if he is eligible, and on the basis of the results of the plasma glucose test of the hemoglobin. So those patients who were having a plasma test at the postnatal period and the fasting plasma glucose level is below 6, okay, it is below 6 millimoles per liter, tell them that low probability of getting the diabetes, and they should continue to follow the healthy lifestyle advice, weight, active lifestyle, diet, exercise, and it should be given after birth. And they will need, still you are not going to discharge them, they will need an annual test to check that their blood glucose levels are normal, and they have a moderate risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and offer them advice and guidance that what they can do. Like they also need to get yearly checkups. Okay, those women who return to you within 6 to 13 weeks and their plasma levels they were between 6 and 6.9, so tell them that they are at high risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So red zone. Okay, so offer them advice, guidance, and intervention, like you need to refer them to the diabetologist. Advise those women whose plasma glucose level is 7 or high. You need to tell them that they likely have type 2 diabetes, and then you are going to offer them confirmatory test to do this, that they actually have diabetes. So about 50% of women with GDM, they go on to develop type 2 diabetes, and you can lower your risk by reaching a healthy body weight after delivery. So they should visit their doctor with your blood sugar tested between 6 to 12 weeks after the birth, and then every 1 to 3 years to make sure that your levels are on the target. That is the point, okay? So another question that they are likely to ask you is, what is the chance that the children of the diabetic mother, they will become diabetic? So what is your opinion? Any thoughts? Do we manage diabetes? Of course, you need to give them insulins, you need to give them everything like that, okay? So there are like in certain ethnic groups, this diabetes is more common, you should know about that. And then you should know about the complications, like what are the effects of pregnancy on mother. But she can have acute complications, she can have long-standing issues like hypoglycemia, ketoacidosis, infections, she can go into coma. If she has type 1 diabetes, she will go into diabetic ketoacidosis. If she has type 2 diabetes, she will go into hyperosmolar coma. But she can go into ketoacidosis also. So regarding the long-standing issues, there can be like microvascular issues. If the smaller blood vessels are involved, then we can have nephropathy, retinopathy, and neuropathy, and worsening blood sugar controls. So what will happen to the pregnancy because of the diabetes? Maternal complications and the fetal complications. The baby, like this pregnancy, can be miscarried. Patient can also develop gestational hypertension, which can progress to develop preeclamptic toxemia of pregnancy, and cesarean section rates are higher because of the macrosomic babies sometimes when they have developed this PET, so the baby is IUGR, cannot tolerate the stress of labor. Then they are more likely to get UTI, and they're likely to get other infections like we can say candidiasis, and they are more likely to get other infections also because of the low resistance and high sugar levels. Then obstetric trauma. Obstetric trauma is not only for the baby, it is for the mother also. Like the baby is large, so she is going to experience PPH. Then the baby is large, she can have ruptured uterus, like if she is pushing the baby and baby is not going out. But the higher chance that she will have PPH, or she will develop third or fourth degree perineal tears. Now going to the fetal complications, there can be congenital anomalies like in the cardiovascular system, most common. Renal neural tube defect, microcephaly, sacral agenesis, hypoglycemia, stillbirth, perinatal mortality, polyhydramnios, and if the baby is IUGR, then you can see oligohydramnios also. Birth injuries are for the mother, obstetric trauma, and for the baby also. The baby will have shoulder dystocia, fractures, fracture of humerus, and then fracture of the clavicle. Brachial plexus injuries, and even asphyxia. Why asphyxia? Because he is not producing the babies of the diabetic mothers, they don't produce surfactant at the expected level, so that's why they suffer. So their lungs can be immature. Then you can see two spectrums like macrosomia and the fetal growth restriction. If there is hyperinsulinemia, then the baby is going to be macrosomic. By macrosomic, I mean the birth weight is going to be more than 4.5 kg. And then fetal growth restriction. What is the difference between small for gestational age and the FGR or IUGR? In the small for gestational age babies, everything will be normal except the size. So no abnormalities in the Leica volume, no abnormalities in the Doppler of the umbilical artery. And this umbilical artery Doppler, that will be normal, okay? But in fetal growth restriction, baby will be small in size, baby will have low Leica volume, this oligohydramnios, and then there can be Doppler abnormalities. Then after birth, baby can have postnatal adaptation problems like many things like polycythemia, hypercalcemia, hyperbilirubinemia, hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia. So regarding the hereditary factors, they are important for you. Okay. So there are known heritable factors in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and the parents, they can be counseled and warned that the children of the parents with the type 1 diabetes, they have a 5 to 6% increased risk of developing the same type of diabetes. And the children of the type 2, so the risk is doubled, okay, 10 to 15%, that they will become diabetics, and so they will become obese, and then they will become diabetic. And the aim of for the treatment should be for the glycated hemoglobin, it should be kept below 48 millimoles, or 48 millimoles are equal to 6.5%. And if their levels are above 86 millimoles per mole, and usually they write down 10%, okay? So then you need to advise them against pregnancy, because first of all she is going to miscarry, and then the baby is going to develop many problems. The most common abnormalities will be those of the cardiac abnormalities, then the neural tube defects, GIT defects, okay? So during pregnancy, the aim is to keep the fasting blood glucose levels below 5.3 millimoles per liter, and the 1 hour postprandial glucose level below 7.8 millimoles per liter. However, women on insulin, they should be advised to maintain their blood glucose levels above 4 millimoles per liter, and women are advised to test their blood glucose 4 to 7 times during the day. So depending upon the level, but the type 1 people, they are going to test it 7 times a day. Continuous glucose monitoring, it should be reserved for the pregnant woman on insulin with problematic hypoglycemia or an unstable blood glucose level. And the good glycemic control, it can reduce the risk of miscarriage, congenital malformation, stillbirth, and neonatal deaths like that. This info is important for you. Another thing which they are going to ask you is that what are the ideal times for delivering the babies. So if the blood sugar level is well controlled, even then you are going to deliver them at how many weeks? 38.
38 weeks.
30, yeah, 37, 38 plus 6 weeks. 38 weeks is the ideal time, okay? And if the blood sugar level is like very problematic, you are unable to control that, and you need to offer this early intervention, give them corticosteroids for lung maturity. And then they can ask you another question, that if the woman's blood sugar level is like very much abnormal, it's high, and you will still give them corticosteroids, because we know that cortisol is going to elevate the fasting blood sugar level of this patient. So your answer is that you will start this sliding scale, and then you will continue this one intramuscular corticosteroids, okay? Corticosteroids, how you are giving 6 milligrams intramuscular BID, total 4 doses. So you can give them hydrocortisone, or you can give them betamethasone. If you will give betamethasone, then you are going to give 12 milligram intramuscular on 2 days. You have given today at 10 a.m., then you are going to give the second dose tomorrow at 10 a.m. Okay? So in either case, we are going to complete the dose within like 24 hours like that. Okay? Because even if you are giving this BID 24 hours or 2 days, because you can say 2 days, because you are giving today and you are going to give it tomorrow also. So the hydrocortisone gives 6 milligrams intramuscular BID 12 hourly, 4 doses like that. So the baby can have the injuries, the problems, so you should know about that also, okay? So that's all you need to know about diabetes. So the notes are there. If you get some time, then go over them, because you can just revise the incidences and other things. Otherwise, the info I have given you, that is enough to answer the questions. But I want you to go over the insulin thing, okay? What is the mode of action? How do they control the blood sugar? Just simple basic things, not like lengthy details. Okay. So the next question is fibronectin cutoff values. So fibronectin. So fibronectin is a protein. So when the baby is in preterm labor, then it is coming out, right? So examination of the receiver operating characteristic curve indicates that the optimal cutoff for a positive fetal fibronectin result, that is at 24 to 30 weeks of gestation, and you want to predict that there is spontaneous birth at less than 35 weeks, then the level of the fibronectin should be between 45 and 60 nanograms per ml. So if where you are checking it into the vaginal secretions. So if in the level of this fibronectin is more than 50 nanograms, then it means that patient is going to deliver in next 7 days. But if the level of fetal fibronectin is less than 50, then it means that your patient is safe and she is not going to deliver in the next 7 days. That is one. Okay. Question number 4. Patient with primary hemorrhage. What is fibrinogen cut-off value? So fibrinogen, again protein, we need it to stabilize the clot. So the minimum level, it should be like 2 grams. My reference is Green Top guideline number 52. Okay, it says that if your patient is having like primary hemorrhage, so first of all, then the fibrinogen level should be kept at 2 grams to keep the coagulation cascade intact. Why it is important? Because otherwise the other clotting factors, they will not work. So we need to maintain this level. So if it is lower than like 2 grams, then we need to give it to the patient. So now I have a question for you. If you have a case of primary hemorrhage, how do we manage it? Second question they like to ask you is, what is the difference between primary and secondary hemorrhage? So who can answer this question for me? So the primary postpartum hemorrhage is the most common type, and it is going to occur within 24 hours. Okay, sometimes within 24 hours of birth of a baby. And then what is a minor hemorrhage? So the minor hemorrhage, when your patient is passing like 500 to 1000 ml. What is a major hemorrhage? When the baby event there is more than 1000 ml blood loss from the maternal genital tract. So moderate hemorrhage, when she is losing like 1001 to 2000 ml, and severe hemorrhage when she is passing more than 2000 ml. Secondary PPH, that is an abnormal or excessive bleeding from the birth canal between 24 hours and 12 weeks postnatally. This is an important um, cause of maternal mortality. Four basic causes: the tone, like tissue, thrombin, and trauma. These are the four causes. Okay, either the tone and this atony, that is the most common cause of having PPH. There can be retained placenta, again the tissue. Then prolonged second stage of labor, again tone, because patient is going to be atonic. Okay, multiple pregnancy, atonic. Previous PPI, so it means that the tone was not good. If she has preeclampsia, so it means that thrombin levels, they were low. If she has fetal macrosomia, so there was atony, so the bleeding couldn't be controlled. Then she had like failure to progress in the second stage, again the tone was not good. If she had prolonged third stage of labor, again tone, because the uterine muscle is exhausted, so the oxygen level, the saturation is not maintained, the patient is hemorrhaging. Retained placenta, the tissue is here, so the uterus cannot contract. So at that point where the placenta is attached, so the pores, they will open up, like sinusoids, they will continue to bleed. Placenta accreta, again tissue and trauma. In the episiotomy, there is trauma. Like it is not regular episiotomy, maybe it has extended, it was not given at the right place. Then perineal lacerations, again trauma, and then the general anesthesia, again the uterine muscle is relaxed like that. So how you can minimize the risk? You need to give oxytocin. First of all, identify the patient who has like low hemoglobin level. Okay, if they have like hemoglobin level is low, you need to give them parenteral, you need to give them oral iron supplements. Okay, so the recommended levels are that, like it should be like 11 grams pre-pregnancy in the non-pregnant, or in the at the time of cooking. Then in the second trimester, it should be like 10.5, and then in the third trimester, even 10 grams, that is considered normal. And the this hemoglobin level 10 postpartum, that is also acceptable. But below that, the blood transfusion is not indicated. But you should know that we need to give her oral hemetinics to maintain the level like that. Okay. So how we can prevent this PPH? There is no benefit of doing this uterine massage, so no benefit. So we should offer active management of the third stage. We should use prophylactic protonics, like if a patient is delivering by an SVD, then you need to give 10 international units of oxytocin intramuscular, and if she is delivering by cesarean section, then we need to give her 5 international units of oxytocin IV stat. And so active management, like use of nutrotonics, early clamping of the umbilical cord, and controlled cord traction. Active management results in lower birth weight, reflecting a lower blood volume from early cord clamping at 1 minute. That is fine. Oxytocin and ergometrin, even this oxytocin, that is fine, and like 5 units, it has the same efficacy in preventing PPH in excess of 1000 ml. Beyond 1000 ml, the rates they will change like that, okay? But they will not ask you. Carboprostin, so neither intramuscular prostaglandin such as carboprost, and then which is this carboprost is F2 alpha, nor misoprostol. Misoprostol is E1, and then the prostin, okay? Prostin, that is PGE1. So all of these things, they are preferable to conventional injectable butyronics, and but not better in the routine prophylaxis, but later at some stage they will become useful when the oxytocin is not benefiting. So neither that all of these products, they are not like very good, they are not superior to oxytocin. That is one thing. Another question they like to ask you, that patient is hemorrhaging and she is asthmatic also, so you will not give them, don't give them carboprost, okay? Because it will cause bronchospasm, so the patient will die because of the respiratory failure, so we don't want to give it to them. That is one thing, okay? So oxytocin, and if she is not hypertensive, then you can give her ergometrin. So carbetocin, it has been developed to be given concentrated estrogen, uh, oxytocin to be given at the time of cesarean section, but usually like it is not like very much helpful, but for the namesake you should know that this is given at the C-section. But the first line is still going to be oxytocin or syntocinon. Enzymic acid that we give if your patient is hemorrhaging like that, okay? So important thing is, sometimes they ask you that patient is experiencing hemorrhage, what is the first step? So the first step is to start giving her oxygen. How much oxygen? 10 to 15 ml per minute by face mask. That is going to be your first action, okay? Start oxygen. Why? Because even when you are giving this blood, uh, what is the purpose of blood? Blood carries oxygen and nutrients to the body cells, so here we want to give her oxygen. So if your patient has minor hemorrhage, then we are going to measure the blood loss, and then you should just gain IV access like 14 gauge cannula. Urgent venipuncture should be done, and 20 ml blood should be taken for Cropent screen in the full blood count, coagulation screens including fibrinogen. Monitor pulse, respiratory rate, blood pressure recording every 15 minutes, and commence warm crystalline infusion. So did you notice here that we didn't cross match? Okay, we just did this group and screen. That is one. Screen for cytomegalovirus infection and for any atypical antibodies. Okay, if the patient had like major PPH, then you are going to activate the major PPH protocol. It means that your patient has lost more than 1000 ml. So pay attention to the circulation, airway, breathing, call someone for help. And here again, the first action, even in the major hemorrhage, is to start oxygen, because we have to prevent hypoxia, asphyxia. Start giving them IV fluid like 3.5 liters of the warm clear fluid. You can give like 2 liters of the warm isotonic crystallide followed by 1.5 liter of the colloid. And then you have to try to get this blood, and if the blood is not available, then you have to think about the alternative fluids, but you need to ask your hematologist. That is one thing, okay? So then what should be done? Like crystallites you can give up to 2 liters, colloids you can give up to 1.5 liter. Blood can be given like if it is immediate transfusion is indicated, so it should be like, if you don't have any cross match blood, you can give O negative. It should be Cal negative, and it should be like CMV negative like that. Okay? That is CMV negative. If you don't get, or then again you can give it to the patient, because now the fetus is not there anymore. Okay, so CMV negative, better to get that blood, but if you are not getting it, that you then as a life saving measure you are going to give O negative. Fresh frozen plasma, so administration of fresh frozen plasma, it should be guided by hemostatic testing and whether the hemorrhage is continuing or it has stopped. Then if prothrombin time or activated partial thromboplastin time they are prolonged, then we need to give them plasma, which should be given at 12 to 15 milliliters per kilogram of the this FFP should be given to the patient. And if the hemorrhage continues after 4 units of the RBCs and hemostatic tests are unavailable, then we are going to administer 4 units of the fresh frozen plasma, 4 units of blood and 4 units of FFP. That is what you are going to give. And even if, why? Because you have given 4 units of blood, so it means that there is a significant loss of blood, right? And your patient was symptomatic of shock. When she will become symptomatic of shock? If she has lost like 40% of her effective blood volume. That is the point, okay? So we are going to give them 4 units of FFP, even though we don't have the lab results of the coags, but don't worry about it, just give 4 units of FFP. So after that we can give them platelet concentrate. So administer 1 pool of platelets if hemorrhage is ongoing and the platelet count is less than 75 into 10 raised to power 9 per liter. Then cryoprecipitate. So administer 2 pools of cryoprecipitate if the hemorrhage is ongoing and the fibrinogen is less than 2 grams per liter. Okay, that is one thing. So high concentration of oxygen 10 to 15 liters per minute via a face mask. And if airway is compromised, then you need to call the anesthetist for the assistance. So then the PPH has occurred. So what will you do for this patient? You need to document everything properly, not only to save yourself from the complications, but also as a guide to the further treatment of the patient like that. So that is all you need to remember about PPH. So now the SPA number 5, that patient has gonorrhea, developed PID, so how are we going to treat her? So I think we talked about the infections during pregnancy, and then in general infections, STIs, so video is there, the notes are there in your document, so I will not go into the details. You should know that if there is gonorrhea, we are still going to give them ceftriaxone, okay? How much, the point is that how much you are going to give, okay? Just remember the dose. The recommended dose is, if you will go to the last year guidelines, it is 250 milligrams intramuscular stat, single dose, okay? And you don't have to give as previously the guidelines said that we need to give azithromycin, okay? So no azithromycin with it. If you go to this one, you are going to give only this one. Similarly, if your patient has chlamydial infection, you are going to give only azithromycin 2 grams or orally stat. You're not going to give ceftriaxone because they said that no benefit of just giving them 2 medicines like that, okay? This guideline was changed last year, okay? Question number 6, that they showed picture of Trichomonas vaginalis. So I just took out one. So if you get something like this, flagellated organism, then you will say that this is trichomonal infection. So in trichomonal, you should know that is most commonly STI, most commonly transmitted STI. So what type of what type of organism is this one? Trichomonas vaginalis. Is it protozoa? Is it bacteria? What is this? What are your thoughts?
Protozoa.
Intracellular protozoa?
Yeah, intracellular protozoa, okay. So at which pH it can survive? High pH, okay. What is the vaginal pH? 3.5 to 4, okay. So the pH is going to be more than 4.5. And what type of discharge it will produce? Greenish, yellowish, green, frothy discharge, okay. What will be the appearance of the cervix? We call it strawberry cervix. Why it is so? Because it is going to cause punctate hemorrhages on the cervix, which can touch to bleed, okay. That is one thing. Okay, so you are going to treat with metronidazole, okay. So do we need to treat the partner or we are going to treat only the patient? What do you think?
We'll treat the both.
Yeah, you're going to treat both, okay? You're going to treat both for 7 days like that. That is one thing. That's all you need to remember. Signs and symptoms, they can be atypical, but they can be like the mostly that we know about them, that they can have a yellowish green discharge. So the most common protozoa infection. So in each exam, they are going to ask you one question here like that. Okay. So the next question, question number 7, post CS, not post of CS, post C-section, but patient and she has pain and fever. So what do you think? What has happened? She has pain, abdomen. So what is the most common cause? Cesarean section, patient with pain. So patient is with pain and fever, and now she is on IV ceftriaxone. After 3 days, in the morning round, the patient is still complaining of pain and fever. Fever is 38 degrees centigrade. So the fever is 38 degrees centigrade. So it means that she is running a high grade fever every night. So WBCs and the C-reactive protein otherwise well, and she is keen to go home. So what should be done? So what will you do for this patient? She is keen to go home. Everyone is. No one likes to stay inside hospital. So MRI scan was given of the patient. What will you do? So I don't know what was in the MRI, but if they are doing MRI, so it means like maybe she had some POCs were there, or some sign and symptom of infection. Correction was there, something was there like that. Okay. So if there are retained products of conception, like it depends at what exactly was the scan. Okay. So this patient cannot be discharged. Okay. If you will discharge a patient like this who is feverish and she has pain, then they are going to fail you in the exam and they will be justified. Never send a patient home who has fever or he has bleeding like that. Okay. So this patient needs full assessment. So this one has postpartum sepsis. Okay. So postpartum sepsis, she is not responding to the ceftriaxone. So they are asking you that are you going to evacuate retained products of conception? We don't know what was in the scan, but if there are POCs in the scan or the ultrasound scan, then after 24 hours coverage of this antibiotics, you are going to do the ERPC. Okay. And if your patient is not responding to this therapy, which in this case she is not, then you need to change the therapy. So this is piperacillin and tazobactam. It provides like comprehensive cover. Okay, if you will go to the RCOG guideline, it says that this is the most comprehensive cover because it is going to cover many things. Okay, so with this information, I would stick with this one, that change the antibiotic and give her something which is broad spectrum. This combination, piperacillin and tazobactam, it covers most of the infections um, in the absence of any culture and sensitivity. Okay, so you can start with this, and once the results are available, then you can go and you can change the medicine like that. Okay. So if the patient is like in the antepartum period with a similar scenario, what medicine you will like to give? Antenatally, you will give them cefuroxime and metronidazole. Okay, cefuroxime and metronidazole. Okay, if you have a similar patient postpartum, she has pain abdomen and like this, so what is the most common infection you expect to see? Endometritis. Okay, so this she is post ND, or she is like post ND or post section. This is the ideal combination which we should give. Okay, because most of the infections they are because of the anaerobe, so we are going to give them metronidazole. If it is this combination is given, go for it. Postnatally, antenatally, choose this combination. Okay, if in the options is given this one, so we know that this combination is ideal because it covers most of the injections. Okay, sometimes if they are suspecting MRSA infection, okay, MRSA. So in MRSA, you are going to give, what do we give in the MRSA? Flucloxacillin, right? Or cloxacillin. Let's say that you have given this one and still no response, okay? So no response, then you should give, what will you give now? What is the complication of vancomycin?
Prednisone.
Yes, don't forget, all of these are SPs, okay? That is one thing. If this vancomycin is not given in the question and you are suspecting that there is MRSA, they must have written teicoplanin, okay? Then give it, okay? Teicoplanin, it should be given for MRSA. So that's all you need to remember, okay? Question number 8, mode of action of metronidazole. There is one lecture on antimicrobials. I understand sometimes that you people have time constraint, but then the point is that you cannot go to exam without repeating them, because you are going to get at least 4 questions from the pharma, from the antimicrobials. Okay, antimicrobials mean that antibiotics, antivirals, antiprotozoal drugs. Okay, all of these drugs you need to know them. They are asking typical question. What is the mode of action? Okay. Then their second favorite question is, these are bacteriostatics or these are bactericidal. Bacteriostatic, like they are going to stabilize the number of the bacteria. Cidal, they are going to kill the bacteria. Okay. So metronidazole, it makes pores into the cell wall of the this one bacteria. Okay, so metronidazole, it diffuses into the organism, inhibits protein synthesis by interacting with the DNA and causing a loss of helical DNA structure and strand breakage. So therefore it causes cell death in the susceptible organisms. So the one which is making holes, sorry, that is amphotericin. We say that amphotericin is terrible because it makes holes into the cell wall. So this is the mechanism of action of the metronidazole. That it is going to inhibit protein synthesis by interacting with the DNA and causing a loss of helical DNA structure and strand breakage. Other question for you, that the patient has STI. Is it safe for her to take flagyl? Yes, it is safe for her. She can take flagyl in all trimesters of pregnancy. No inhibition. That is one thing. Okay. So then, and the, this flagyl. What is the most common side effect of taking this flagyl therapy?
Metallic taste?
Metallic taste is one thing, nausea and vomiting. Okay. So that's why better to give it with food. And the metallic taste, yes, they are going to have metallic taste, and then a small amount is secreted into the breast milk also. So we need to care about that also. So the mother is breastfeeding and she needs to take this flagyl. What will you do? Your answer is that, yeah. Then you will do what you will do. You will say that she should feed the baby and then she should take this drug like that. Okay, that is the answer. That is the way forward. She should take drug and then she should feed the baby, and then after that she should take the drug, and then after 2 or 3 hours she can feed the baby again. Because the problem is that we don't have any good alternative of the flagyl. That is the reason. Okay. So that's why we need to give flagyl to cover anaerobes. Okay. SP9, what is the mode of action of clindamycin? The clindamycin, the best thing about it is that it switches off or neutralizes all toxins. Neutralizes all toxins. That is the only good thing about it. Okay. And what is the bad thing about it? All toxins. That is, it is given in cases of sepsis. Okay. In sepsis, good. What is wrong with the clindamycin? Resistance. What is how many people are resistant to this clindamycin? Also SPA, 16% in UK and 25% in USA. So 1 in 4 or 1 in 6 is not going to respond to clindamycin. Why? Because it has been used so massively, so extensively that now the bacteria are not dying by this drug. Okay. So clindamycin, it inhibits bacterial protein synthesis by binding to the 23S ribosomal unit and then 50S subunit of the ribosome. So clindamycin is bacteriostatic. Okay. Don't need to remember like 101 things. Still clindamycin is required in many things. Okay. So if the sensitivities they show that patient's illness shows that the secretions are that he has infection with some agent which is sensitive to clindamycin, you need to give it to her like that. Okay, that is one thing. Okay. Question number 10, fluconazole mode of action. So fluconazole, first of all, tell me what type of drug is that?
Antifungal.
Okay. So this is antifungal. This is fluorine substituted by triazole antifungal agent. So its mechanism of action, like that of other azoles, involves interruption of the conversion of flanosterol to ergosterol by binding to the fungal cytochrome P450, okay, and a subsequent disruption of fungal membranes. So that is the mode of action of the fluconazole. So what happens? What happens if? Can you hear me? Okay. Question number 11 is, what is a false negative? For a false negative rate, we don't know exactly what they ask in the question. So sensitivity and specificity, they are statistical measures of the performance of a binary classification test that are widely used. Sensitivity is called true positive rate. It measures the proportion of positives that are correctly identified, like the proportion of those who have some condition affected and who are correctly identified as having the condition. They actually have the condition. Sensitivity is true positive rate. Specificity is true negative rate. It measures the proportion of negatives that are correctly identified, that is the proportion of those who do not have the condition, they are unaffected, who are correctly identified as not having the condition. They are actually healthy people. Okay, just remember that true negative rate, specificity. True positive rate, that is sensitivity. Okay, just remember it. So sensitivity, very important to have real concepts on sensitivity and specificity. And last week, we had like 2 comprehensive lectures on these subjects. So but you guys were not attending, so that is the problem. Okay, so just come back and just go back to those lessons and then try to answer the questions like that. So the sensitivity, if they ask you about the sensitivity, Dr. Bindu, can you hear me?
Dr. Isa, I can hear you.
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Isa.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. That's why I closed. Sometimes, this internet thing is beyond my control, so then, I did this one. That better to close and then go back. So that is one thing. That is one thing. So that is one thing. Okay. So sensitivity and specificity, okay? Okay. Just one second. So what is sensitivity? What is specificity?
Yes, Dr. Isa.
Okay, dear. So sensitivity is the true positive rate. It measures the proportion of the positives that are correctly identified. That is the proportion of those who actually have some condition affected and who are correctly identified as having the condition. So, and then they have the condition. Okay, sensitivity. It is sensitive. It has picked out the people who really had the disease. Specificity, that is called true negative rate. So it measures the proportion of negatives that are correctly identified, like the proportion of those who do not have the condition, like unaffected, and who are correctly identified as not having the condition. If you are looking for the screening test, if they ask you what is the best screening test, okay, best screening test, that is sensitivity. That's the high sensitivity, okay. That is the one with high sensitivity. Okay, if then it is to, this is the specificity. Okay, this is actually going to identify the people who are not having, who are healthy people. Okay, healthy and they don't have disease. Okay, so if you have to do any confirmatory test, choose the one with high specificity. Okay, then this is how you are going to choose the tests in the exam. If they ask you that which one is the best screening test, you will select the one with a high sensitivity. If they ask you which one is the best confirmatory test, your answer is the one with the high specificity. How do we calculate them? You know, it's like lengthy process. Everything is given in your notes. If it comes in the other questions, then I will show you, because can a full biostat lecture if I will repeat here, it will take like 4 hours. Okay, so I insist, please listen to those videos and read those notes. They are really, really important for you. Very much to the point. And if still you have any problem after going through them, please let me know. Question 12. Patient underwent surgery for colorectal carcinoma and ovary was swollen, otherwise normal at next stage. So bilateral oophorectomy was done with hysterectomy, and they gave picture of the ovary shown, that what is the cause of condition, like that. Okay, so actually she had colorectal carcinoma. Okay, and it has involved the ovaries also. So in which condition we get the colorectal cancer and the ovaries?
Lynch
Yeah,
syndrome.
yeah, in the Lynch syndrome. So this patient was having Lynch syndrome. So do you think that this was like a good thing to have take this bilateral, to do this BSO or not? We don't know that what exactly was the question, but you should never do anything without consent of the patient. Okay, and they were doing like this colorectal, maybe this history of colorectal cancer was positive, like that. Okay, so then the point is that you will have to go and do the full evaluation. If you just open for a benign condition but it turns out to be like a malignant one, then stop, close the abdomen, tell your anesthetist close the abdomen, and then do the full workup, like do all markers, see that what is the extent, because the primary surgery is the best chance in disease eradication. Okay, so if you will not take them out, then she is going to have problems like that. That is one thing. Okay, so you need to see, so this is Lynch syndrome, in which your patient is going to have lung, breast, ovarian, colon cancer, like that. Okay, sometimes like in the endometrial, the patient can develop endometrial cancer also, or she can develop endometrial cancer secondary to the ovarian cancer. As a rule, whenever you have some patient with malignancy in one part of the genital tract, you need to go to the other part to exclude this. Okay, that is one thing. Okay, so SPA 13, laparoscopic picture of falciform ligament. Falciform ligament, you know that this is the ligament which is connecting the anterior surface of the liver to the anterior abdominal wall. So I don't know what was the exact picture in the exam, but if you will just open the abdomen, that's what you're going to see. That will be the ligament, and you're going to see that like this fatty tissue, because thin ligament is strong ligament, but longer than this one. Okay, so if they will show you, just you should know that where is the falciform ligament, the exact place. I remember showing you, yeah, I remember showing you certain pictures that where exactly it is located like that, okay? So where it is located between the anterior surface of the here. This is the site, okay? Look at this one. This is the falciform ligament, okay? The fat is on the sides, that's why we are getting this picture. So this is like, if this is the left triangular ligament, and this is the anterior ligament between the anterior surface of the liver and the anterior abdominal wall, okay? And this is the right triangular ligament. Right triangular, left triangular, and this is the junction, okay? And the lower part that is called the ligamentum teres hepatis, like that. And this is formed after obliteration of the fetal umbilical vein. So umbilical vein is closing and we are getting ligamentum teres. So these are important ligaments. So this is the bare area. Why do we call it bare area? Because it is devoid of any peritoneal folds. And what are these ligaments? These ligaments are formed, these are by the thickening of the peritoneum. That is the point, okay? That is one thing. Question number 14 says 4-week embryo germ cells, they are found in the, where are they found? Yolk sac or the genital ridge? Genital ridge, right?
Yolk.
Why yolk sac? Genital ridge. What is genital ridge? Thickening in the posterior abdominal
Technique.
wall. Thickening in the posterior abdominal wall. Okay. So at least the first lesson in the embryology and then the urogenital development. These lessons you need to read, and for the other systems they are available on your page. You need to look at the pictures at least, okay? And if you don't feel like doing from the notes, then at least do something from the basic sciences, the book. I uploaded that, shared that book in the group, okay? So anything you don't want to read from the notes, because the notes are lengthy, I know that there are like more than 100 pages for every subject, but you know, reading them is easy. Why you see so many pages there? Because they are double spaced. Why double spaced? So that you can read them easily, okay? So don't be like afraid to see the length, just go over them. If you don't like to read the notes, just go to the basic sciences, okay? At least these small notes you can do them, okay? SV15, 6-week amenorrhea, pregnancy test is positive. So anyone who is like in the reproductive age group, so first test you are ever going to do is pregnancy test, okay? And then you should do something else, because the diagnosis, the spectrum, it will change like that, okay? So then she's bleeding, she has and the ultrasound scan shows 23 millimeter sac, no fetal pole. So what is the diagnosis, okay? So actually 23 she is bleeding or she has something. So if they are asking you that as sac, so where is this sac? Like they are telling you no fetal pole, so I think that it is in the intrauterine pregnancy, okay? So for the diagnosis of intrauterine, for this miscarriage, the sac diameter should be, sac
25.
diameter should be, yeah, 25, should be equal to 25. Before that, don't do anything. It should be 25 millimeter, or CRL should be 7 millimeter. These are the findings on transabdominal scan, okay? On the transvaginal scan, RCOG says that the same findings should be there, but the minimum can be like sac diameter 20 millimeter, or the CRL should be at least 6 millimeter, okay? But we are going to stick with this one, okay? Because the RCOG removed that, which one is there, okay? So if this finding is not there, then you're going, this patient, you will see that how much bleeding is there, okay? At 23 millimeter, this is intrauterine pregnancy, no fetal pole, so we don't know that the dates are sure or not. If she is like having heavy bleeding, or the os is open, then of course you are going to evacuate. If there is no bleeding, then you are going to do what? Rescan in 7 to 10 days. So it depends upon your judgment. Whenever you are stuck in the exam, don't feel upset, okay? So this an embryonic pregnancy This is not the answer. An embryonic is there, but you know, we don't, if they ask you, so it will depend what type of pregnancy is this one. So if you can say like, usually they don't use this terminology like an embryonic or something like that, okay. So they can say early fetal demise, okay, early fetal demise, okay, or late fetal demise. They can use any terminology. So just read the question, don't forget this one, okay. Even if like they tell you like the pregnancy was confirmed before but now it is not showing anything, so still you are, if the patient is stable, then repeat the scan in 7 to 10 days. That is your answer, okay. So patient SPA16 homocystinuria vitamin deficiency. So if there is deficiency, what will happen? This is a minor, what, your patient is likely to develop thrombosis, okay. So this is a minor thrombophilia, familial type, okay. That is one thing, homocysteine deficiency. And then she is likely to develop myocardial infarction because of a high cysteine level, homocysteine level. That is all you need to remember, not a major one, okay. Minor thrombophilia. Question number 17, patient with brains inside what gram negative bacteria. So patient was inside, okay, and their drains inside, okay. So we don't know that this patient was diabetic or what. Usually they will, if they will tell you about the infection, they will tell you that the moment the patient is diabetic. In diabetic Pseudomonas, the infection is more common, okay. So then here some people said that how is Pseudomonas, the same question, okay. Pseudomonas, okay, they said the drain is there because it is going to, the catheter associated UTIs, okay. The most common cause will be, again, what will be the most common cause? Staph, right? E. coli, Pseudomonas, anything, you name it, all of them they can cause catheter associated UTI, okay. But maybe this patient was diabetic or she has like, they are telling you, so maybe this was Pseudomonas. Gram negative, gram positive, can be anything. Then in the next question they asked that how is Pseudomonas on culture. Go to microbiology, a simple classification algorithm for the gram positive, gram negative is there, and then the common gram positive and the common gram negative. Everything has been put into like separate lists. Please listen to them, to go and see them. They are very important for you, okay. So Pseudomonas, the culture, it is we can inoculate Pseudomonas aeruginosa into the LB broth, and what can happen? LB broth will be there, and with appropriate antibiotics, and they grow culture of the Pseudomonas for 16 to 24 hours at 37 degrees centigrade, and add 0.6 ml of the overnight culture, which is like cryogenic, and we are using vial with 0.4 ml of the glycerol, like that, okay. So Pseudomonas, they look like these rods, okay. Please go to your notes, there are many pictures, so you should know. Sometimes they will tell you that this Pseudomonas, first tell me, this is gram positive or negative?
Gram negative.
Yes, excellent. It's a gram negative rod, like that. That is one thing, okay. And it is going to cause infection mostly in the immunocompromised people, like in the diabetics also, okay. So this bacteria, they can, the problem is that this bacteria is widely present in the environment, okay. So your entry, sometimes they will ask you that your entry, you have entered the room of patient and you have experienced some fruity odor. So what is that thing? So your answer will be the strong fruit-like odor. You will say that this is Pseudomonas, okay. So basically, you know, it is going to affect the people who already have like the lung diseases, they have problem with their immune system, And then sometimes, if it doesn't respond to the specific antibiotics, so then sometimes we have to give them like TNAM, like that, which is carbamazepam, imipinam. So culture and sensitivities are important, I think. Okay. Then the question number 19, lower segment cesarean section described. So I don't know what exactly they asked you in the questions. So it was lower segment cesarean section. If they were asking you about the process, then you should know that which incision should be given. So Joel Cohen. Okay. While Joel Cohen, because associated with less maternal morbidity. Okay. So then the point is, where do we give this Joel Cohen? 3 centimeter above pubic symphysis. Above pubic symphysis. Okay. Pubis symphysis. So here we are not cutting the things, we are simply separating them. So associated with less maternal morbidity, like that, and quicker approach to enter the abdomen. Before we used to say that finasteride is the best, but now we say for the last 10 years that the Joel Cohen is a better one, because associated with better maternal outcomes, less need for the post-op analgesia requirement. Okay. So then the question number 20, it says that patient with fever and on ultrasound there is fluid in the pouch of Douglas. So the fluid in the pouch of Douglas. So first of all, you should know that up to 5-6 ml of the blood, or 5-6 ml fluid is normal. Why it is there? Because this is the pouch of Douglas is the deepest part in the pelvis, like that. Okay. So then the problem is that this patient, they can have collect the fluid there, and they can become like symptomatic, so they can develop PID, and then we need to cover them with IV antibiotics, like that. Then and there will be injury. Okay, that is one problem. So that's why a little amount of fluid is normal. But if there was like excessive fluid, if she is like symptomatic, there is history of having this PID, then we are going to treat with IV antibiotics. And if she is pregnant, then we have to see that she is carrying an intrauterine pregnancy and there is no ectopic pregnancy, because in ectopic also, if there is hemorrhage, you are going to see fluid into pouch of Douglas. That is one thing. Okay. If there is perforation, then again the blood will be there, but you will read the scenario carefully. So mostly you will have to think about PID or ectopic pregnancy. Okay. So in the question number 21, in the Lynch syndrome, what is the oncogen? The Lynch syndrome. Just now we said, so first of all, tell me what type of syndrome is Lynch syndrome? What is the mode of inheritance?
Autosomal dominant.
So it means that in Lynch syndrome, you are going to see that in the family, in the all generations, like that. So this is also known as hereditary non-polyposis colorectal cancer. Most common cause of hereditary colorectal cancer, like that. That is one thing. Okay. So then the question is that how do you know that this is Lynch syndrome? So what is the oncogen? Regarding the cancers, you should remember it can cause endometrial cancer, stomach, liver, kidney, brain, but the most common will be colon cancer, colorectal cancer. So the genes in cases of Lynch syndrome, actually in the Lynch syndrome, if I tell you about the oncogens, these genes are MLH, okay, then MSH2, then MSH6, okay, then PMS2, and finally there can be EPCAM. Okay. So these genes, MLH, MSH2, MSH6, PMS2 and EpCAM. These genes, what they do, that these are protective genes, okay? Basically all of these are protective genes. But then what happens? One person has inherited this Lynch syndrome gene. So what happens then? These genes are effective, okay? So these genes cannot work, can't work properly. So we are going to get cancers. That is the problem, okay? So result is CA. So they will not give you all the genes, okay? They will give you the combination. So as you know that there can be like many things. So if the patient has like some changes are there, and these are the genes, okay? It can affect any of these genes, any combination can, because there is going to be mismatch repair of the DNA like that. That is one thing. That is the basic phenomenon. So if like we are not doing it properly, then the person is going to get colorectal cancers. That is the most common, but other organs also like that. Okay. So question number 22, third generation progesterone. Which one of the following like that? So actually, you know, they can ask you about any generation. So you should remember that in the first generation progesterones, we have norethindrone, we have norethindrone acetate and ethinodiol. Second generation are desogestrel and norgestrel. Third generation progestrogens are norgestrel and norgestimate. Fourth generation is drospirenone. So which one is the safest contraceptive pill? So generally the low dose birth control pills, they are the safest pills, but it can be like combination pill, like in the form of both progesterone and estrogen. So generally, if we are talking about the contraceptive pills which contain progesterone, so progestin only mini pills, they are considered safest, okay? And they have the lowest risk of causing blood clots and the most so which one are these drugs like that? Conventionally, which drugs we are using? So you should know that Cerazette, which contains which progesterone it has. So this is safe because it can be, if the patient has forgotten, can be taken within 36 hours. That is one thing, okay? So then sometimes they would like to ask you that which of the androgens is which of the progesterones is the most androgenic, like it will cause like growth of hair follicles, many hirsutism and virilization like that, okay? So the most androgenic is methyl testosterone, then gestodine, then levonorgestrel, then norgestrel, and then desogestrel, okay? So the second generation progestins, which have varying degree of androgenic and the estrogenic activities, and these include levonorgestrel and norgestrel. And newer gonans, or the third generation progestins, these are reported to have the least androgenic potential, third generation one, okay? And these include desogestrel and norgestimate. So desogestrel and the norgestimate, they have the lowest androgenic potential. So these are like the safest drugs. And progesterone, that is naturally occurring hormone in the body, which originates from the ovaries, and it has various duties in the reproduction and menstrual cycle. And progestins, they are synthetic, okay? They are lab created hormones, and that is meant to mimic progesterone, and as it acts does in the body. It eases anxiety and promotes memory. So the doctors, they recommend that the progesterone, it can be taken before bed because it has sedative effect and it will help resume normal sleep cycle. It is important to note that progesterone is a bioidentical hormone and not a drug treatment. So that is the thing, okay? Just remember first, second and third generation and the fourth generation drugs and drospirenone that is contained in the pill just mean like that, okay? So these finger things are very easy. Please don't lose marks here on these things, okay? That is one thing. Question number 23, PCOS. There will be high prolactin level because of what? So actually the prolactin, if you attended the class before, I told you before that prolactin and gonadotropin releasing hormone move in opposite directions. What do you understand by it? They have reciprocal relationship. If there is too much prolactin, then the message goes to the body that the female is either pregnant or she is lactating, okay? So in that condition, the level of GnRH, it will decrease. GnRH is required to do what? GnRH is required
To stimulate
Well,
FSH and
maintain, yeah.
I'll clear the fire alarm on the north side. I'll clear the fire alarm on the north
Okay.
side.
Yeah, you want to say something?
for FSH and LH release.
Yeah, here in this patient, what is the reason why this prolactin is high?
High LH and FSH in PCOS.
Yeah, so here they didn't give us that one, so we will go for the high LH. That is the thing, okay? So the LH is high, so everything is high like that. Estrogen is also high. Androgens, they are also high, but androgens, they have no effect on this production. If there is high LH, it will go back and it will tell the hypothalamus that don't produce this gonadotropin releasing hormone, okay? So there will be no GnRH and we will have high LH like that, okay? In here we are also going to have high androgen, but you know all of these things, they are not like high in each condition like that, okay? In most of the conditions the LH and FSH, they will be low, but since in PCOS the basal level of the LH is high, so, and we need a spike of LH, so LH surge doesn't occur in cases of PCOS, so ovulation doesn't take place and there will be hyperprolactinemia, and the androgens, they will not be high. High androgen like FSH, LH can be there, but the androgen releasing hormone, it will be less. Okay. So the question number 24 says, what is half-life of the LH? So the biological half-life of the LH is 20 minutes, shorter than that of the FSH. So FSH has half-life of how much? 3 to 4 hours, okay? And the LH, it has half-life of just 20 minutes. Just remember, because important difference, okay? So then the biological half-life of LH is 23 hours and a subcutaneous or terminal half-life of 10 to 12 hours like that. Once the basic level is achieved, so then we are going to get these things like that. So it is 20 minutes, okay? For the FSH, we have just read that what happens, this one has like higher half-life, like it will change. On average, it is 3 to 4 hours, but it depends upon the administration that we have given. It is endogenous or it is exogenous like that, okay? So if we are giving like from outside, so then it will have like after intramuscular and the subcutaneous, it is going to have a longer half-life. And after the IV administration, obviously it will have shorter half-life because it is available quickly and then it will be metabolized quickly also like that. Okay, then in the SP25, internal anal sphincter nerve. So they're asking you what is the nerve supply. So the internal sphincteric autonomic nerves, they supply the internal anal sphincter, and they are formed of union of different nerves, like the nerves which are coming from the Arbash nerve plexus of the most distal part of the rectum, and then the inferior rectal branches of the pelvic branches. which are running along the conjoint longitudinal muscle cord, like that. They are asking about the internal ones. So external anal sphincter, that is supplied by pudendal, right? So there is a combination of both the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Okay. Question number 26, bulb of vestibule nerve. So which is the nerve of the vestibule, like that. So like these are just like the different structures, like you should know, you should be able to tell that which structure is lying where. So this is the body of the clitoris. You know, the hood has been removed. This is the clitoris. This is the crus. This is the urethral orifice, the vaginal orifice. And then, you know, we have the greater vestibular glands. And which glands are these? This is bulb of vestibule. Okay, you can see because it is hidden under the labia minora, so that not very obvious. We are going to see only the openings, and these are the greater vestibular glands, which are located at 4 and 8 o'clock position. And this is the foreshae. Okay, that is the thing. So basically, what was the question? Which nerve supplies the vestibule nerve? What will be your answer? So which is the nerve of the perineum?
Pudendal nerve.
Yeah. So pudendal nerve, how many branches it has?
Perineal, rectal, and dorsal of clitoris.
Yeah. So basically, you should remember three things. Okay. The nerve of this one, the vestibular nerve, that is pudendal, right? So pudendal nerve, that is the nerve. Okay. So its branches. Its branches are, as you mentioned, the dorsal nerve of. This is important. That's the nerve of the clitoris, because always, you know, 3 points they're asking you the question here. Okay. Then the second branch is the perineal nerve. Perineal nerve of the external genitalium. Then the third branch is the inferior rectal nerve. Okay, these nerves are very important for you. So through the inferior rectal nerve, it is going to supply which area? The external anal sphincter. And then it also gives supply to the which one? Urethral sphincter also. Okay. And that's why if there is pudendal neuropathy, then the patient can develop urinary dysfunction also. Okay, that is one thing. Okay. SP number 27, appendix of the testis, from where it is derived. So appendix testis, or the hydatid of Morgagni, this is a vestigial remnant of the Mullerian duct, and it is present on the upper pore of the testis and attached to the tunica vaginalis. It is present about like 90% of the times. The appendix testis, in some people it can be absent like that. Okay, so you know that this is the inguinal canal. Okay, we said that it is just lying below the inguinal ligament. So the 4 centimeter length, and this is the internal ring, and this is the external ring. Okay, and the cord is passing through it. So the spermatic cord is there, and then you know this is the epididymis. Spermatic cord, it will pass through the inguinal canal, and here are the testes. So it is attached to the posterior surface. So this is the epididymis. Okay, testis, epididymis, and then this is the fold, which is called the appendix testis. It is not attached here like that. Okay, and as we read in the anatomy, it is covered by the tunica vaginalis, which is the remnant of the cord, because this cord of the processus vaginalis, because of the cord which brought the testes from the abdomen to the scrotum, because we know that the testes, they develop in the abdomen and they are pulled down into the scrotum. That is one thing. Okay. Question number 28, structures which are developing from the mesoderm. So mesoderm, ectoderm, and which one? Endoderm. So all derivatives, they are given in the embryology notes. Please just look at them. because these are very simple questions. Okay, so the mesoderm, it gives rise to skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, blood vessels, bones, cartilage, joints, connective tissue, endocrine glands, kidney cortex, heart muscle, urogenital organs, uterus, fallopian tube, testicles, and the blood cells from the spinal cord, and lymphatic tissue. This is the rough thing, okay? But you should know about the derivatives of all layers like that, okay? Then in the question number 29, they asked ultrasound resolution best at what options, and we were axial and the other modes don't remember. So basically, if we will go over the biophysics, axial resolution, it is defined by the equation axial resolution is equal to half the spatial plus the length. The spatial pulse length is determined by the wavelength of the beam and the number of the cycles or the periods within a pulse. For example, decreasing the number of cycles in the pulse or increasing the frequency of the pulse, they should improve axial resolution. And by way of contrast, the lateral resolution is defined as the ability of the system to distinguish 2 points in the direction perpendicular to the direction of the ultrasound beam. Resolution of an ultrasound beam is defined in 3 planes: axial, lateral, and the elevational planes. Axial resolution, this is the ability of the discern between 2 points along or parallel to the beam's length path. So the lateral resolution, or we also call it horizontal resolution, that is the ability to discern between 2 points which are perpendicular to the beam's path. The axial resolution, it has to do specifically with the distance, okay? So any unit of distance, it can be used to measure the axial resolution. The most common units of measurement of the axial resolutions, these are the nanometers and the centimeters. So the axial resolution, that is the ability to see the 2 structures that are side by side as separate and distinct when parallel to the beam. So a higher frequency and a short pulse length, it will provide better axial image. The width of the beam is inversely related to the frequency. Higher the frequency, the narrower will be the beam. High frequency, so frequency is the number of the vibration cycles that occur in 1 second. And the lower the frequency, the lower frequencies, they will produce less resolution, but they have greater depth of penetration into the body. And higher frequencies, they produce greater resolution, but depth of penetration is limited. Ultrasound, typically it is used in the clinical settings, and it has frequencies between 2 and 12 megahertz. In the lower frequencies, they produce less resolution, but they have greater depth of penetration into the body. Higher frequencies, they produce greater resolution, but depth of penetration is limited. Transabdominal ultrasound scanning, it will be done with moderately distended bladder by using real-time scanners with low frequency probes. So when for the abdominal, we have low frequency probes like 3 or 3.5 megahertz. In the transvaginal sonography, it is done with a real-time sector scanner using high-frequency endovaginal probes. So they can be between 5 to 7.5. Some have 6, some have 7 after the patient voids urine. Transabdominal transducer, they commonly use 3.5 to 5 megahertz, and transvaginal, they use 5 megahertz and higher. So when obtaining images with an adjustable frequency transducer, it is important to start the lowest frequency to be sure that no deep structures are missed. Okay, that is like the simplest things that you need to remember, and you need to read these biophysics from the basic sciences, because there they have given the summary. So don't go to Allison or my notes, they are lengthy. Okay, just go to this one, basic sciences, because today is already 17th of June, so you are just like 20 days away from your exam. Okay, question number 30, semen analysis of teratazospermia. So a normal sperm count, it ranges from 15 million sperms to more than 200 million sperms per ml of the semen. And anything less than 15 million per ml or 39 millions per ejaculate is considered low. Low sperm count is often referred to as oligospermia, and a total motile sperm count over 20 million is considered to be normal. Lower than 5 million is the poor sperm motility, and less than 1 million is severe poor sperm motility. So they will show you something, then sometimes they ask you what is the most common abnormality. Oligo asthenoteratospermia, where the shape is abnormal, motility is abnormal, and the count is abnormal. Okay. If one parameter of the sperm is abnormal, then you will repeat the test after 3 months, the semen analysis. Okay. If two parameters are abnormal, it is considered highly abnormal, and then you will have to repeat it as soon as possible. Okay. If one parameter is abnormal, you can send your patient for intrauterine insemination. But if two parameters are abnormal, then we call it severe abnormalities of the sperm, and then we have to send those patients for ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection. All of these notes are available in your original page. Okay, there are so many guidelines and everything which you need to cover for the exam, it is given there. But don't try to read full notes, only the relevant points, like the numbers, facts, figures. So these are given in a separate folder also. Okay. Question 31, recurrent miscarriages, so which HLA is down regulated. So if a recent, the studies have shown that HLA antibodies and the occurrence of the miscarriage, it occurs. However, they include studies, they show that the patient can have like clinical and statistical heterogeneity. So what do you think that which one of them is associated with miscarriages? G, okay. HLA-G has been associated with miscarriages. Question number 32. The junctions in the uterine smooth muscle that aid contractions. So these are desmosomes or the gap junctions. Okay. So your uterine muscle is smooth, it is not hard muscle, so there are not desmosomes. Desmosomes are like tight junctions like that. So the trigger for the smooth muscle contraction includes hormone, neural stimulation, and the autonomic nervous system and the local factor. In certain locations, such as the wall of the visceral organ, stretching the muscle, they can trigger its contraction. So this is stress relaxation response. So it occurs because of the gap junctions. So there are no tight junctions, there are gap junctions like that. Okay. Question number 33. Which abdominal organ secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone? Liver, pancreas, and other options like that. So GnRH is secreted in a pulsatile fashion from the hypothalamic neurons into the portal circulation, where gonadotropin releasing hormone receptors on the anterior pituitary, they are activated with subsequent secretions of the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone like that. Anterior pituitary. So they are asking you that which abdominal organ produces it. So do you think that any abdominal organ produces GnRH? Actually, we know that GnRH, releasing hormone is coming from the hypothalamus. So this is just a recall. So just remember from where we are getting the GnRH. Okay, that is one point. We are getting it from the hypothalamus. Okay, question 34. During surgery, you are doing tap block to prevent post-surgical pain. So what layers will the needle pierce to reach this space? What do you think? Any one of you? Anyone? We had seen several pictures. Any one of you can volunteer. Try to remember, there are so many images on your web page. You need to review them, okay? Anatomy images are very important for you, and the file is available on your notes, so you know that how many structures are lying there. If you look at the back of the patient, the abdominal layers are there and the layers of the back. So the layers of the back, you should know that from posterior to anterior, these are like skin, subcutaneous tissue, skin, subcutaneous fat, supraspinous ligament, interspinous ligament, because they can ask this again. Okay, so the skin, followed by, after the skin you are going to see subcutaneous fat, if there is any, but little amount is always there, subcutaneous fat. Then the next layer will be supraspinous ligament, then can be interspinous, that is also ligament, interspinous ligament, supraspinous ligament. Then there is going to be ligamentum flavum. After ligamentum flavum, we will have dura mater, because we know that the meninges, they are covering the spinal cord and the brain. So dura mater, once you have picked it, then you will have subdural space, and after that arachnoid matter, and finally you will go to the subarachnoid space. That is the point. Okay, skin, subcutaneous fat, supraspinous ligament, interspinous ligament, ligamentum flavum, dura mater, then subdural space, arachnoid matter, and then subarachnoid space. Okay, so the next question is SPA 35, fetal hemolysis, which is detected by which test? Direct Coombs test or the indirect Coombs test? So you should remember that direct and indirect antiglobulin tests, these are called and we also call it DAT or the Coombs test. So in the direct antiglobulin or the Coombs test, what we do is, like, this is the serum, like in the direct, this is the blood of the patient, and then we are combining it with the anti-human globulin. So agglutination will take place, so it means that anti-RBCs antibodies are there, and the DAT is there, anti-human globulin is there, so it is going to bind to the cells, and the cells which we want to test. Okay, then this is the direct one, because direct Coombs test, because this is the patient's blood and we are doing it directly. Now in the indirect Coombs test, here we are not taking the blood, here we are taking the plasma, and then we are testing the RBCs and the anti-human globulin, that is added to the mixture. So if it is agglutinated, then we will say that the indirect Coombs test is positive. So the direct Coombs test, that is performed by adding anti-human globulin to the patient RBCs. The indirect test, it is performed by adding patient plasma to test RBCs, followed by the addition of the anti-human globulin. In either case, the presence of an anti-RBC antibody, which is like the autoantibody or alloantibody, it causes RBCs to be agglutinated when the anti-human globulin is added. That is the base of the Coombs test. In DAT, agglutination occurs when the anti-human globulin, which is green, cross-links, and the anti-RBC antibody, like the blue, that is bound to an antigen on patient RBCs. Like indirect test, antiglobulin test, it means that agglutination will occur when the anti-human globulin, it cross-links an anti-RBC antibody in patient plasma or serum to which the test RBCs, they were added, like that. Okay. SB 36, dome-shaped ulcers, due to which organism? Dome-shaped, you know the shape of the dome. Okay, so that will be due to molluscum contagiosum. That is the point. Okay, so that is the viral illness. So which organism causes it? It is due to which virus? Pox virus. And what is the significance? That is the largest virus in size. Flesh colored ambi. That is the thing. Okay. SP37, pendrin in thyroid transport. What other molecules? The answer, chloride. Okay, the sodium was not there. Okay. So what is the role of pendrin in the thyroid? So initial functional studies of pendrin in the xenoplasmocyte, they have demonstrated that pendrin is able to mediate transport of chloride and iodine, and that it can act as a chloride formate exchanger. So when we want to take iodide into the cell, we will push chloride out and we will take the iodide in. So this process is facilitated by pendrin. SP38, pregnant woman, flu-like symptoms, fatigue, fever, backache, and the baby delivered with the respiratory depression, jaundice, hepatosplenomegaly. So what happened to her? Mother had flu-like symptoms, fatigue, fever, backache. So what she could have, and the baby is delivered like this. Respiratory depression, and there is jaundice and hepatosplenomegaly. Baby has respiratory depression like that. Okay. So what do you think? This is, what can be this?
Streptococcal infection.
If there is streptococcal, then that is bacterial. So that will be full-fledged infection, purulent discharge. And hepatosplenomegaly is not a feature of streptococcal infection. This is listeria. Okay. Listeria, it is an important cause of IUFT. Okay, it can cause meconium staining of liquor. Like that. Okay.
Ma'am, a flu-like symptom with listeria, like I could not understand this. Like I was thinking, I'm just asking for clearing my doubt. Herpes simplex like this, it will not cause these symptoms like respiratory depression and jaundice, hepatosplenomegaly for the baby?
CMV. That's a good question. Herpes simplex virus, herpes zoster virus. They all can cause the same thing. Okay, this condition. Listeria, sometimes the patient will have only fatigue. Okay. If you have streptococcal infection in strep, there will be like at least fever. Okay, like that. Okay, and the baby will have pneumonia in first 24 hours. That's why early onset group B streptococcal infection, because here in all of these things we cannot say that what exactly is causing these problems like that. So pregnant woman, flu-like symptoms, but yeah, it is not like that. There is fever. Fever is the distinguishing point. So fever means that this girl has, this is the correct answer. Sorry, I missed this word fever like that. Okay. So she has fever, so this is group B, and the baby has like these, all of these symptoms, could be anything. Okay, but if there is pyrexia like this, then you are going to say that this is the answer like that. Okay. The listeria, it can cause a spectrum like that. There can be respiratory depression, and there can be also in the mother, and there can also be on the diarrhea. That is one. Okay, it can also be there. So if you have GBS, then what is the screening test? And you are going to take the history, and you need to give something to the mother. So how we can prevent this? How we can prevent this illness?
Benzyl penicillin?
Yeah. How much?
antibiotic, 3 grams loading
3
dose,
gram loading.
1.5 gram 4 hourly until delivery.
Yes, 3 grams IV loading dose. So you see, I just couldn't read this fever, so it cost me 1 mark. So read the question very very carefully. Okay, then 1.5 grams 6 hourly. If your patient is sensitive to benzyl penicillin, what will you like to give them? Before we used to give them clindamycin, okay, but now the new guideline says don't give them.
Ceftriaxone?
Yeah, give them cefuroxime, I think. Ceftriaxone, cefuroxime, I think, in the guideline. Okay, if she's actually they have written not cefuroxime, they have written cephalosporins. Okay, so in my unit also they like to give ceftriaxone. Okay, so you can give anyone, better to give third generation. If your patient is sensitive to this one also, then what will you give now?
Can we give vancomycin?
Vancomycin. Okay, so no clindamycin. Why? Because 16% resistance. Any question, any problem? Okay, dear doctors, thank you very much for participating. Can we stop here?
Yes, Dr.
Because
Yes, doctor.
I don't want you to passively listen to me. Like we have spent like 2 hours on these questions. How many questions are there? Just 38 questions. Okay, remaining questions are there. So I'll be giving it to IT to upload on your web page. These will be available. Other records are also available. Tomorrow again we are going to practice with them, because you must have seen that if you misread one thing, you miss any point, you are going to have the issues like that. Okay, so the topics are important. We have revised like so many points here. So I will repost the link of the page that contains all clinical guidelines for you guys, because these are like very short guidelines, not like the lengthy ones. So you need to go over them once at least, so that you should be able to apply these concepts in the exam. I will try to take you with the part 2 people also, like when we are going to revise like all algorithms, like all the charts given in the green top guidelines, NICE and other important resources like the TOG articles stuff. So we are going to do that very quickly. Okay, so make it a point that you also join the part 2 people, and part 2 people, they will be joining you also, because in their exam also like 10% questions are on basics like that. So okay doctors, thank you very much for attending. Tomorrow we'll continue, so see you tomorrow. And if I was not clear about anything, please post in the group so that we can address the issue. Is it okay with you?
Yes, Dr. Isa, thank you.
Okay, dear doctors, thank you very much. Thank you for attending it. So looking forward to see you tomorrow. Take care, study well. Bye bye.